As opposed to my usual practice as a philosopher, which is to write a text and then go in front of people and basically read it, which is a very odd thing that philosophers do that is just getting under my skin more and more as I realize that, yeah, other people don't do this, oddly enough. I only took a few notes when I was thinking about this topic of resilience in the classroom. And specifically, I asked myself, why is it actually important to address this topic of resilience in the classroom? Not just because Bill asked me, Bill is so nice, and I'm happy to say yes. It's occurred to me that there is a fundamental choice that students can make. And some of you have been students recently in my courses, and some of you have not been in my courses. I don't want to judge of how when you were a student. But I think there's two possible ways to approach a course as a student. You can resist it, or you can open yourself to it and become more vulnerable as a result. Of course, now I'm talking about the social sciences, about the humanities, what goes on in the sciences might be a bit different, but I think there's still, I think this will still be relevant here. Basically, we have a formula that's more or less imposed on us, where we're expected to give out assignments for students to read and to have exams about halfway through and towards the end of the semester. There's some flexibility around that. But it's very difficult for us as professors to think about a course in terms of what we will evaluate as opposed to what we want students to get out of it. This is what we want students to get out of a course is often intangible or very hard to assess, even through the most imaginative kind of assessments. And so I've more or less stuck to making exams and assignments easier or more fun or more engaging to approach instead of changing that drastically, because I'm still early in my career and I'm just struggling to actually make that work. But unless you really care about the course, it's hard to do well there. And I think that's one of the main obstacles for the course to make sense personally. That students will take a course because they want to have their major, they want to have their degree, they want to get their credits. So students have this basic choice to make sure that they don't care, and so then they simply go through the motions and succeed reasonably well, which means that they'll resist the course. Or they can actually engage themselves in it. And I feel that my task is to make the course interesting and relevant to students' lives. My task is to get students to open themselves up and become vulnerable to what I'll be teaching. Well, of course, you need to be resilient if you're going to be vulnerable. There's this possibility, especially when you're facing political text, political realities, and philosophical texts, which is why I teach here, to be shaken, to be surprised, to have your basic presuppositions, your basic opinions about the world be brought into question. There's often very violent texts that will come and try to break your whole worldview, your whole approach to the world. Feminist texts do that very well. Environmentalist or ecologist texts do the same as well. They basically tell you everything you think you are is dangerous to other people or other things. So it leads you to, it seems to the students to either close up to it and to resist engaging those texts, or to engage with it, and I think that's where this resilience comes in. So I think in philosophy, you've got texts that are difficult to read, difficult to contextualize. They've been written a long time ago. It's not clear why you should care about it. Mm-hmm. So there the challenge for me is to get that relevant, but it's a good obstacle for students to face. But it's one that often leads them to remain close to the ideas in it. If they are read, if they are understood, these texts will question our basic assumptions. So our reaction either way, because they're difficult or because they are difficult to take, will be to resist the text. When we embrace the text, they can shake us. They can leave us without any clear answers to the challenges there, and there's a bit of a crisis that can take place. Often when we look at the history of philosophy, the history of political thought, we have things that are just outright offensive to us. And they're sexist, they're racist. They basically argue in favor of slavery, in favor of colonization. There'll be anti-democratic texts. And there's a tendency, even amongst philosophers, to just push that away. Well, it's contingent. It's not really part of the real message, so we'll just paper over it and move on to what really matters here. But I think to really understand the text and have it be relevant to us today, we have to be vulnerable to those basic questionings of our presuppositions. They're a good time for us to ask ourselves, why do I care about equality? Why do I care about fairness? Why is exploitation a problem for me? But again, to ask these questions, to bring into question our basic presuppositions, our basic values, is difficult. And this is where we need to learn to be resilient if we're actually going to continue instead of just stopping along the way and not pushing that questioning further. In Canadian politics, take the other series of courses I teach here, we have a bit of a different issue. They can be very technical texts, meaning they can be very boring. How do these institutions work? There's a lot of very technical aspects to them. So that's what will drive students away. They don't care a lot much, and I don't usually require that students know how many seats there are in the House of Commons. I think we're at 308. I'm having a hard time keeping up myself.
And they're redrawing the
That's right, all the time, right? So it's really hard to keep
much to Quebec's chagrin.
That's right.
Because they're going to lose seats.
That's right. There's a guarantee, but it's a guarantee that it won't go below a certain number, not a percentage, right? So that's the first issue. The second issue is that our democracy is broken. There's a whole series of books that are quite mainstream called the Democratic Audit. Most textbooks recognize that there is a democratic deficit or kind of shortcoming with our democracy. So there's a lot of focus on the problems, the challenges, the roadblocks, the powerlessness, the failures. So that the question that the students are going to ask, that I ask myself, is what's the point? What's the point of caring about it? What's the point of trying to change anything? This question, of asking what can we do when everything's going so badly and apparently no one can do anything about it, we're powerless to make any change, that's demoralizing as citizens. So, I'm going about teaching my courses, I'm getting my students, I'm shattering my students' convictions, and I'm demoralizing them as citizens, which is exactly the opposite of what I want to do. So I think this is where resilience comes in. This is where I have to go beyond simply delivering my teachings about the state of the Constitution, the state of the country, or the basic ideas in our canon. So how can we be resilient when we're shaken? I'm using this idea of being shaken. It's been put forward by a Czech philosopher named Jan Patočka, who was actually talking about people who were at the front during the First World War. Obviously, it's not that kind of life-shattering, life-changing experience. What he's talking about is that there are moments when collectively, we, or as individuals, we face such great challenges that our very relationship to reality itself is brought into question. Our very understanding of who we are is brought into question. And to me, that's, to a smaller degree, through much less violent means. That's a little bit what the experience of going to university might entail. So we need to be resilient. We need to be able to overcome that drastic challenge as students, as professors as well, so that we can remain vulnerable, so that we don't latch on to certainties, that we don't latch on to dogma, so that we can remain open to other people's ideas and people's positions. And all I found so far as a solution to this problem is to say, well, all I can do is teach by example. How do I get through it? Obviously, I manage, since I've gotten my master's, my PhD, and really been ridiculed by my peers, as always happens at conferences and you know at your defense and so on. So how have I managed to be resilient? So I've thought about, you know, the best professors I've had, the best researchers that I've seen, the friends I have who also succeed. So if I'm able to help students relate what they're reading to their lives, to their values, to what matters to them, I think that's the first thing that will allow them to be more resilient. I do it because it matters to me. And so I think that there's a role for values to come into the classroom, not as the basis for dogma or for limiting our what we're going to be allowed to discuss or bring up in terms of opinions, but, you know, more basic values about truth, about honesty, about openness. I can show them the patience that's necessary to, on the one hand, to approach these difficult texts, and on the other hand, by using examples from politicians who do manage to make a difference without being complete authoritarian dictators, showing the patience that's necessary for action to lead to something, to some kind of a result, even if it's not the right result, to carry on even though actions usually fail or come short of what politicians try to do. And I think overall, the best thing I can do is to remain vulnerable, to not come into the classroom in a position of authority, but really to come into the classroom as someone who has the experience. I mean, I've been through this before, so I can guide you through it and help you find your way through it. And I can ask students to make sure that they know why they are doing it. Of course, you're doing it for credit. There's no way around that. But there's something more for it. That you can't take a course just for credit and get anything out of it. If you engage with the course, if you think about why you're in university, why you might want to have a profession, an occupation that requires the kind of skills you'll acquire in university, then you can actually give an answer to the question, why are you here? Why are you coming to class? Most of the time. And I think where that begins is by me giving that answer to students, me being vulnerable and open to their questions, open to changing my own perspective, and to set up things like examinations not as not from a point of view who, as I like to joke about in class, one who has the mighty red pen, but as one who can ask questions to guide students and to help students synthesize and demonstrate their understanding, so that we fulfill those requirements around credits, and so that we also fulfill our hopes as human beings. So that's my basic approach around resilience. I didn't want to come in here with too much of a roadmap, too much of a text, although I have been monologuing for about 15 minutes. But I'd like to take a couple minutes at least to ask you if, first of all, this resonates with you, and you face these kinds of issues, and second of all, if you could tell me about examples. Times when you might have either encountered ideas that forced you to question your basic assumptions, or when you've been when you faced, say, political reality, social reality, in a demoralizing way, and how you've gone through that, if you have. Of course, this is on a volunteer basis. I want to call on anyone. Although there are people here who are in their professional capacity, whom I might appeal to because of their experience.
I'm happy to volunteer. If no
Thank you,
one
Bill.
else does. My challenge, I suppose, for a number of years now is knowing that students, even if they're taking 3 courses, but if they're taking the normal full course load of 5 courses per semester, if they want to graduate in the normal 4 years, that we're making them jump through so many hoops. There's just so much coming in at the same time. There's no time to reflect on what they're learning. There's no time to absorb it, digest it, reflect on it, think about it, value it. It's just, I've got to do this assignment by tomorrow. I've got to write this essay next week. I've got to do library research before then so that I can write it. I see this in my own son, who's my second son, who's an Augustana student now, and he's in drama. But he's frightened by these essays. When he has to write an essay, he knows he has to do this research, and he's very smart. I mean, he's good at cracking stuff out at the last minute, but that's how he gets it done. And there's got to be a better way than that. There's got to be a better kind of education than that. And even in my own courses, it's got to be better than exams and midterms. And I teach math and some computer science, so it's a very exam-oriented, assignment-oriented, jump through this hoop and then that hoop oriented kind of education. But I don't know how to break out of that. I'm trying in my small ways, but it's late in my career, and I don't know if I'll be able to do it before the end. I mean, it takes courage. It takes you have to be willing to take risks. You have to be willing to take a hit on the universal evaluations of students, because every time you experiment, I mean, we know that some people are going to hate it because it's not what they expect. And some people will love it, but on average, you will suffer in those first few years of experimenting. Maybe forever you will suffer. And the university takes very seriously these USRIs. I think at Augustana we're a little more open-minded, a little more, I'm trying to think, we have a broader view of things, and maybe they do it at the main campus, but really the educational system is as broken as the political system. It doesn't work. Our politics is geared towards 5-year windows when we need to plan for 20 or 30 years, 50 years. And our educational system is broken into these little 4-month windows. It's crazy. It's absolutely frickin' crazy.
You wanted to jump in?
I have a solution. This is going to be a plug for ePortfolios. This is why I became Associate Dean, was to address this exact question. It was driving me nuts that our students were let me back up. We've been assuming that students are putting the pieces together on their own, that students are making the connections on their own. And you're quite right. Unless we help them think through that, unless we lead them through that, unless we give them just the simple questions to metacognate, they won't do it. So this assumption that we've got that students are doing it is a false assumption. So what we need to do is we need to build into our courses assignments that ask them to do that metacognition. And it does mean that we have to redesign what we're doing and what we're expecting from them. And for me, the best solution I've come up with is ePortfolios, is where students are sticking up their work, and then we ask them, okay, tell me what you learned. Explain what you learned and connect this to other courses or other learning in this particular course. And you're quite right about this, this compartmentalizing of learning. Drives me nuts. But unless we give students the vehicle in which to break down those compartments, it's not going to happen. So with ePortfolios, you have them do that over the whole 4 years, not just for one course. You ask them to bring those things in. But at the same time, the ePortfolio is only a technological solution. We, as instructors, still have to give students the questions that will allow them to go on that metacognitive path, that journey. Because I know for myself, I've been assuming that they've been making those connections. And the very good students do. But there are some students who, like you're saying, Bill, are feeling overwhelmed. And so they're not giving themselves the space to think about, so why am I doing this? What's the point? And much to the amazement of many students, I'm sure, we think about those assignments fairly carefully. And there are reasons why we have given them to them. But unless we're explicit about those reasons, students won't see them. And so two things. We've got to, whether it's e-portfolios or something else, but we've got to design in our coursework some kind of vehicle where we encourage students to do that metacognition, and we encourage them by giving them credit for it. And the other thing that we have to do is that we have to give them the skills, the questions, to facilitate how they start asking those questions. Those are two things that we have to do. And those two things, I don't think, my very limited experience with trying to experiment with this, I don't think you will take as much of a hit as you think you will. For example, last term when I first tried this, and I was just trying it around Augustana's 4 skill requirements: writing, thinking, speaking, and research. Those 4 things. Just by laying it out and saying, okay, I want you to take this assignment, and I want you to fit it or explain it to me how it has facilitated your ability to learn research skills, or writing skills, or speaking skills. And the students just said, those are requirements in our program. They had no idea. They had no idea. And so just that simple, 10 minutes, also is like the world opened up for them. Oh, so this is why I'm doing this stuff. It was really, really quite something. And when I was marking their e-portfolios, not all of them, but more than I expected, started to get that sort of stuff and started to try to knit some of that stuff together. So I don't think it's as difficult as we think it is. We ourselves just need to place the structure in our courses. And it's not as onerous as we might think it is.
I think it's interesting that you both taking the approach of talking about orientations, right? So what are we orienting ourselves towards? And it tends to be things like evaluations, right? So we have the universal student rating of instructions, which are formed by students evaluate us much in the same way that we evaluate them. That is with numbers and with very little feedback. And then we have a chance to switch this orientation towards exams and assignments around a little bit by using tools like ePortfolio. So we're changing the way we think about what students get out of our classes. And I think that's one very constructive approach to make sure that programs and courses deliver what they're supposed to be delivering. But I think if we're going to be talking about orientations as well, it's very interesting that so much of our orientations and what we discuss is end results that are evaluations, that are markable. And while I think that there's definitely a place for that, I think it's have to work at least. I'm interested in switching the orientation towards the people in the room. And so then there's a whole part of the teaching of the time in the classroom that is spent not so much on working up towards an exam or an assignment, but working towards the relationship that we have as people in this classroom, which is granted a lot easier in the humanities than it is in math. I assume that Morten, you've got some opportunities as well to help students question their relationship to their environment by taking them different places. I've seen some of that in your course description, the new course forms, right? That's a big part of what you do as well.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of how to respond to your question, and I mean, much of what you said, I think resonates with me, and I think I've experienced the same things. And I don't know if this is going to address your question, but I'll try. And Bill, I agree with 99% of what you say too. And in my own way, I think, how do I try to make, I'm not sure how this connects to resilience, and I'll have to say that maybe I haven't attended enough resilience theme things this year, but sometimes I still struggle with, okay, what is this resilience thing we're talking about? Like, what is it really about? And maybe it's because it's a little more complex issue than you know, food to fork or field to fork or whatever that was. But I think that in some ways our education system as it is, and the way students are students, and the way teachers are teachers at all levels of institutions, educational institutions, doesn't teach any sort of skill. It's not great at teaching students to be resilient to the experience of living, and the experience of being in the world, and the experience of dealing with the complexities and challenges of being a human being on the planet, partly because, as you've said, students want the credit. So therefore what they want to know often is, what are the hoops I need to jump so that I can get the credit, and how do I do it that in the most efficient, least painful manner? And how do I do it so I don't have to think about it or think about who I am? Just tell me what the heck it is I have to do, I'll do it, and then I'm going to move on to the next. It's a bit like sort of, well, I don't know, that metaphor's gone. But so I think what I try to do in my teaching, and I, you know, I think like all of us, it works for some students, it doesn't work for others, and sometimes it's a great idea that fails, and sometimes it's a great idea that's a great idea, is to think about how do I provide students with an organic experience that's going to help them experience what it is I'm hoping that they will learn. So often when I teach a course, I'll say to myself, what is it I hope that students are going to learn from this? What kind of experience am I going to have to create that's likely to facilitate that learning? And the last thing I think about is, how the heck am I going to evaluate? Partly because, and I'll say this in front of the dean, I just can't get too excited about taking it too seriously. Because I really don't care too much about the evaluation. I care more about what they've learned. That's the key thing for me. And then I'll try to do my best to evaluate it. But I'm not going to get too hung up about it. That really pisses some students off. Because what they want to know at the beginning of the class is what's going to be on the exam. Exactly. And that's what I'll focus my learning on, and to heck with anything else.
Sometimes those are the best students.
Mm-hmm.
The ones that get the highest grades.
They're the best students in terms of our robotic system of education.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if I'm getting to your question, but I guess the resilience part for me, I guess, is what I really want to do and try to help students to be able to be resilient is, first of all, disrupt them just enough that they're uncomfortable, but not overcome with fear and anxiety. And also, I mean, in some ways I want them to think about environment, but I think the bigger thing that I want them to be aware of is, I want them to be aware of who they are themselves in community and in place. And I think some of the most powerful learning experiences I've had with some students, and this has gone south with some students, it hasn't worked for everybody, is to engage them in a group experience. And what I mean by a group experience is, you know, like some sort of prolonged outdoor experience where, you know, we might be out for anywhere from 4 days to 4 weeks. And so you engage them in a group experience where you sit down in your little community and talk about, how are we doing? And what are you learning about yourself? What are you learning about being in a group? What are you know, all those sorts of things, which often result in pretty painful, difficult situations. And I have to be careful because I'm not a therapist, and sometimes I wished I was. But I think ultimately, if the education system doesn't, I guess for me personally, in what I do, certainly the subject matter is important, and it's not to be ignored. But I think the process is more important. And if we don't learn something about ourselves as people and the way we live on the planet and the way we interact in groups, if we don't get that part at least explored a bit, then the subject matter is really irrelevant, whether it's math or philosophy or whatever. I rambled a little bit. I don't know. Is that what you're after?
Absolutely. I mean, it was meant to be open.
Yeah.
I'm not looking for answers from you.
So the resilience part, I guess, for me is to say, how do I help a student be resilient, be strong enough? How do I help them to be confident enough in themselves and yet also humble enough in themselves to realize that they have the courage and the wisdom to be able to acknowledge that they're not perfect, and that they can be wrong at some times, and at a point in their life they're probably going to, well, they will find themselves where the appropriate thing is to say, gee, I'm sorry. And their way of surviving isn't to be defensive, but to be open.
It's been a good time to bring Dr. Corrette then. Since we have invited you here.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to say that I consider the key to education is not me as a prof talking, but me as a human listening. I think teaching is very much in a Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, an I and thou relationship. And it's a two-way street. And sometimes, as a religious studies scholar, one could have the impression that the academy operates in a pre-lapsarian mode before the fall. I think rather when Professor Hackburn says that the system is broken, why? I understand by that there is a dissonance between the theory of education and the reality of what André Malraux put in his 1933 seminal work, The Human Condition. I believe that education must reflect the human condition. And that human condition is broken. So how do we take that sense of powerlessness, that vulnerability, the fear of failure, and turn the tables so that the hurt becomes the strength? I believe we have to begin with the brokenness of the human condition. And when we talk about dialogue, writing essays, I remember, Plato. I'm very, very pleased to be in the company of Professor Mononson as a philosopher. Plato's dialogues really are a paradigm, a pedagogical paradigm, that ultimately we are narrative beings. We're natural-born storytellers. We have stories to tell, and we need to tell those stories. And more importantly, we need someone to listen to our story. I have the privilege now, we have the privilege of having 4 grandchildren, a 5th that we're awaiting any day. Even before they can talk, they have stories. You walk through the door. I live 5 minutes away from the grandchildren, so I go there on a daily basis. And I honestly believe that the key to teaching is the child, including the child within the adult. Within ourselves, we will always perceive ourselves to some degree as a child. So I teach the child within, no matter what age. When I walk through the door of our son and his wife and their 4, soon 5th child, even the 18-month-old just runs to me, and it's unutterable, but clearly wants to convey a story. So I began to change my teaching to create a space where each student could tell their story. And more importantly, where I could listen to it, where I could hear it. Grandchildren and students want nothing more than to know you are listening to them with 300% of your attention span. Why is that so important? Just listening meets what psychologists call felt needs. One of the key dimensions of education, and this is the heritage of the post-Enlightenment era, the Age of Reason, the 1700s, is we evacuated the affective. What is the role of the affective in cognitive acquisition? When we integrate the affective, the curriculum sticks. So I began not with where the manifesto is, I began with where the student is. By creating a space where they can express their feelings about the document. I'm a historian by training. Historians value nothing more than primary sources. That's the name of the game in historiography. I began to ask myself, what's the ultimate primary source? Human beings. Even as a religious studies scholar who deals in sacred scriptures, whether the Quran, the Torah, or the Bible, everything we have came, including the sacred scriptures, is mediated through human beings. And I began to see students as the ultimate primary source. They're the natural resources. So how could we bring out, draw out, elicit, encourage, cultivate, foster, nurture, that they would bring out their natural resources that are untapped within? So I began with where they're at. And I think there's again, I'm quite pleased to be paired with Professor Melançon. What has come out of this discourse so far is essentially the educational system is, in philosophical terms, teleological. It's goal-oriented. I would argue in philosophical terms that we need to effect a paradigm shift and take an ontological approach. This philosophy of being. What is their condition? How are they? Because the goal is not the GPA, is not the essay, is not the credit, is not the degree. They are means to an end. The end, because philosophers speak in terms of ultimate questions, the end is the human condition. How, as a grandparent, as a pedagogue, and I love rock and roll music, God forgive me, I think in terms of you too. What will I leave behind? In Islam they say, only Allah lives forever. That's an ultimate reality check, folks. Every one of us in this room, on our backs, there's an expiry date. How do I make every moment count? And I believe it's in that I and thou relational. Ultimately, education is about human relations. How do we cultivate in the classroom human relations? There was a song back in the 80s. We all need the human touch. So I make it my goal to humanize, to personalize, to individualize education. And the way to do that, I believe, and you'll see it if we have the privilege of your participation this afternoon, you'll see, yesterday I led a dialogic workshop. And I should say, and I'll announce it now, though they didn't know it yesterday, the dialogic workshop was on the writings, the poetry of Ms. Naomi McIlraith, who's with us right now. And I hope we'll have the privilege of sharing with her and with the audience how the members of yesterday's dialogic workshop individuated. They were all reading from the same page, but each one of them had their own experience of the poem. So I believe in a Lockean sense, John Locke, that all education is if it's going to really be effective, it's got to be experiential. They've got to experience the curriculum. And ladies and gentlemen, the curriculum is you. It's the person. It's the human being. That's the ultimate curriculum. Now, I can drone on here, but many people refer to my approach to education as Socratic. It's based on asking questions. And so Socrates would encourage us now to take a moment to invite you to ask questions. And I have a principle in all the seminars and courses I teach. The only wrong question is the unasked question. So I invite you to ask questions.
I wanna,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yes, Naomi.
Hi, Morton. It's been a while since how are you doing?
I'm good, you?
Good. I liked what you had to say.
Oh, thank you.
Professor Melson, you talked about leading and guiding people in the classroom. So I wonder, because when I came here, I was a mature student. I was about 32, I think, or 33 when I came. And when I teach now, I have a whole range. I have 18-year-olds, and I might have someone who's 60. And I find that absolutely rich and exciting. But I just wanted to know how, either of you, how do you guide someone who's older than you, like by maybe quite a large margin, who has perhaps more experience than you, who may not have the academic experience, but they have really rich life experience. So how do you guide them? How do you lead them?
Go ahead. Sure. I've asked that for myself many times. I'm young. I'm very young compared to most professors, all professors. So that's always been a bit of an issue. There's not a huge difference in age. When I taught you, we were all the same age. I think in the end, the way I approach it is the same way I approach it with everyone. I encourage students to bring their experiences, their values, their interests into everything they do, and increasingly so. So if you disagree, those who have taken my courses, I'm doing it more now, I promise. And so by drawing on personal experience, then there's a sense in the student's work, but also in the classroom, where there's a lot of learning that goes on through the participation of students, and so that's one way. But when speaking about leading or guiding, I'm really referring to the experiences that I have, right? That's what I have really, that's been officialized by a PhD and whatever else, is the experience of going through these texts, or of going through this very spiny, very rigorous study of political reality and philosophical texts. And so that's the experience I can bring. That's what I can give to students. But the meaning of what we're studying, of the actual contents of these texts, of these ideas, that's going to change from person to person, and that's going to change based on the context in which we're experiencing the text and approaching them. And so there's a lot that can be drawn on in the case of all students, really. And the challenge then is to find a way to get the other students in the classroom to see the mature students as peers, and for mature students to feel comfortable in speaking to the other students as peers as well, because even though I have experience with these texts or with these realities, I'm as lost as anybody else. I don't have the answer. So our reaction to it, I think, at that level, we're on the same level. But what I can do is say, well, I get these texts. I can contextualize them. I know what they're referring to. I understand their logic. I'm used to it. But that's really all I've got. Did you want to address it too?
Well, there's another hand up, so, and I'm not sure how long people can stay. Yes?
I have to be careful because so many things that you've said resonate with me. Even though I came a little bit late, I apologize, but still, so many things resonating for me. It almost feels like this table could become group therapy for instructors.
There's the point.
And the reason for it, just So for people who don't know me, I teach biochemistry and cell biology. And so this idea of making the connection with the student, like as you were saying, is a little bit more difficult in the sciences than the math. The only way that I know how to make that connection is to try and share the passion I have for biochemicals. But at the same time, how do you make that real for students? How do you make them engage in the sense of why this should matter? It's much easier to make students understand how the politics, the constructions of societies, our philosophical understandings of ourselves. That's easy for them to make a connection. But as soon as you start getting into the abstract of biomolecules or math, it's difficult. So I've always tried to lead with my passion for why it really interests me. But one of the things there's a couple things, but one of the things that comes to mind right now that resonated with me is the idea of getting students to experience the content, getting students to experience the curriculum, and instructors as the ultimate curriculum. So I'm wondering if that's part of, in an indirect way, when you allow students to see why it matters to you, it opens up the possibility for you becoming the curriculum, which is a very scary thing to do, which is why I'm saying this is a little bit like group therapy here, because to be an excellent instructor, I've always, especially after going through that 3M nomination with Kim, one of the things that really struck me is that being an instructor is an incredibly personal endeavor in which you have to put your very being on the line anytime you get in front of the students. And if you're not comfortable with yourself, you can't share. And if you're not sharing, you're exactly right. Students are going to make the connection, and so they're not going to engage. The other thing I was going to say, and this is going back to something that Morton was saying that also really resonates with me, is, and this is very true in the sciences and biochemistry. It's just a hurdle that we have to come over. Is how to get the students to respond beyond just the content and respond in a way that makes them think about how is this experience in this classroom, in this course, going to be used to build who and what I want to be, and with an aim to what impact do I want on this world, as opposed to just give me the credit. Just give me the credential. And then one of the things I was hearing you say, Martin, is saying, if that's all they're doing, it's really not education. It's really not education. So how do you get students to come to the realization or come to a point where they see what they're doing in a particular course in relationship with their peers and with their instructor, that they're investing in themselves, they're creating themselves, they're preparing themselves for what kind of impact they want to have on the world, whenever that might be. One of the things I worry about is that our present educational system does not set up the program that way. It does not set up the program to say, okay, you're coming to school not just to get a credential, not just to get a transcript, not just to get a degree, but to build yourself. So ask yourself, what are you building yourself for? What impact do you want to have on the world after this? And once I get to that point, then biochemistry becomes really easy to teach, because then I can start getting to think about, okay, so what are the implications of some genetic diseases? What are the implications of taking care of people who have diabetic shocks? What are the implications of trying to deal with the pathogens that you might encounter in everyday life? And those things can have an impact on how we live with ourselves and with other people. One of the things that I've been coming to is trying to figure out how to allow students the experience in my classroom such that they're getting something similar to what Morton is talking about in terms of getting them to encounter themselves and other people. It's hard to do in the sciences. But one of the things I've been experimenting with the last couple of years is this idea of team-based learning, where students get into groups and they're talking to each other. And there's a chance for leadership, there's a chance for cooperation, there's a chance for students to actually say how they respond to the material, which I think is really important. Because if they don't get that chance, I don't think that their understanding sinks in. They've got to be able to talk about it. They've got to be able to read about it. The problem with that, though, so there's this tension between getting students to have the opportunity or experience to, in a sense, play with the content, to play with what we're trying to teach them. At the same time, there's that tension with the students dealing with it and being active and experiencing it. At the same time, giving instructors a chance to tell our story too. Because I really think you're right in terms of the most powerful education is when you can weave what you're trying to teach into a story, because then it matters.
And particularly because you're in the hard sciences, as is Professor Hackburn, I think it behooves us to come to terms with what we inherited from the Enlightenment, from the Age of Reason, from rationalism. I would argue, and I believe there's no way to understand the history of literature, why the Romantic period, and by Romantic, of course, I'm not referring here to lovey-dovey, but the Romantic era, which follows on the heels of the Age of Reason. Victor Hugo and Byron and the others. I believe one of the legacies of the Enlightenment is a false dichotomy between the subjective and the objective. And we get scared. The minute something's subjective, it's bad. It's wrong. There's no place in the academy for the subjective. But what Romanticism in literature taught us is that when you begin with the subject, you can arrive at the truth, albeit by a much more meaningful medium. So I think we need to rethink what we took, what we posited. I mean, really here, philosophically speaking, we're into epistemological questions. Philosophy of knowledge. How do we know? The one thing we remember from John Locke is that everything we know through sensory perception. Of course, he's the one who gives us the idea of the tabula rasa, the blank slate. So why don't we create as many experiences in the classroom where they can use all of their senses? And there I believe the scientist has a distinct advantage.
Let me like to add quickly that, to clarify my own statement before, philosophy is often taught very dogmatically in the way that I've received it. It's not necessarily about thinking through it, but really to understand the rigor and the history and the canon. And I think there's this Enlightenment-driven understanding of science as a technique, as a set of tools to understand, to use reality. And of course, if you're going to approach it in that way, then it becomes a very technical course where it's very hard to bring in human aspects and subjective aspects. But if we see science as a way to understand ourselves and the world around us and a way to relate to it in a better, more meaningful manner, then hopefully, and this is not up to me because I don't have the necessary background or experience to have the right kind of imagination that you might have for your own courses. But if you see science, if you see math as a way to experience the world, to experience ourselves, then there's a way to shift the manner in which it's approached in the classroom and in work itself.
That helps.
I want to say, because now I realize our time is going, we talked about this on Wednesday evening. What is the one feature that distinguishes humans from all other species on the planet? Language is a key figure here.
Rationality?
Reason? Let me just, it's creativity. We, unlike all other species, are creative. Look at the built environment right here on this campus. You know, I'm seeing these beautiful wells of light that you've got in your new structure, and then I see the old structures, architecture. How much do we create a space from elementary to secondary to university and indeed to post? How much room do we give to creativity in the classroom? And it is what defines us as a species. So whatever our course is, whatever the syllabus is, whatever the curriculum is, let's integrate creativity as the means whereby they can individually appropriate the subject matter.
Norman, I think reason is also important.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Leah.
I mean, both reason and creativity are, and probably lots of other things, are unique in the magnitude to which we show them, unique for our species. But what you're talking about is integrating reason with creativity, and that's what the Enlightenment broke down. I'm more and more convinced that the Enlightenment, while a good thing in some ways, has separated us from ourselves in a lot of ways, separated the objective from the subjective, as you say. And we need to reintegrate those.
And integration is the key here. The human condition, they're not just bringing their brains in the classroom. They're bringing their sexuality, they're bringing their identity, they're bringing a bad hair day, they're bringing the whole package into the classroom.
They're bringing their egos.
Exactly. So how do we address the whole package and not just the mind? And in its enthusiasm, and I understand why they did this, there have been many abuses in the church and religion. In its vigor, their Enlightenment sought to evacuate religion. But what the Romantics teach us is that when you do this, what's the place for spirituality in the human condition? Spirituality, broadly defined, we must address the human spirit. What did Augustine say? The heart has reasons which reason does not know. And this is a false dichotomy, reason and imagination. On the contrary, and here I would reference Mikhail Bakhtin and his University of Texas publication, The Dialogic Imagination. Another false dichotomy is reason and imagination. In actual fact, our brains are constantly in dialogue. What's happening here inside us is a dialogue between reason and imagination. So let's not precipitate out, to use a chemical term, reason and imagination. Let's affect a synthesis. So how could we find catalysis? How could we catalyze? How could we bring the objective curriculum to the subjective reality of the student, and through a catalyst that will affect a synthesis and indeed transform the student? Because ultimately education should entail what Kafka would call metamorphosis. If you come out of this university unchanged, we haven't done our job.
If I could just tell two very quick stories, recent conversations I had. One was with a young woman who I believe is 29. She didn't go to this institution. She has an education degree. She then did a 2-year after degree in Native Studies. She's not Aboriginal, but that was important to her. And then she did a 1-year museum studies certificate. There was a Cree language meeting a couple of months ago, and she told me she was so frustrated. She was working for an engineering firm in work completely unrelated to her studies. She was so angry she punched a wall and broke her hand, and she felt passively suicidal. There were a number of us in this restaurant, and I couldn't hear very well. So later I emailed her, and it had been quite a while since I had seen her, and I didn't know her very well. But I emailed her to say how great it was to see her and to talk with her and her work on the Cree language. But I told her I was concerned about her, and if she wanted to meet with me and talk, and that I might be able to connect her to someone that could help her. The second, she got back to me and told me more about her story, and she does have resources, so that's good. The second conversation I had was with an engineer, a person. I like people a lot. This is a person I do not like. I find him quite condescending. He's married to someone I really, really appreciate, and I'm concerned about her because of him. So, but I've reached out to him because I'm not an engineer. I live in the imagination. So I was reaching out to him and asking him about his career as an engineer. He has an MBA and a master's in engineering. And the conversation, what do engineers do? And he said engineers, his response to that was they apply scientific. They take theory and they apply it. Like that's a vacant response. My response to him is that, and I was trying to honor him because he's put a lot into his career. I was trying to honor his career choices. Engineers help us solve human problems. So there's a river to cross. They build a bridge for us. Or we need to get from Rome to wherever, and they build a road for us. So the reason I just share those is, we're talking about education. We're talking about being teachers in a place like this, but then there's a reality beyond that. And there's these two people. He's doing fantastic. He's an engineer. He's in the hard sciences. She's not doing that well. That's what's happened to them. They're both. She's got as much education as he does, just in a different way.
I think this brings up epistemological issues. First of all, how do we establish a dialogue between the arts and the sciences? I began to realize, at first I had nothing but art students, and I invited a scientist in. And all HLL broke loose. And I was asking myself, what happened? And I realized the frame of reference was totally different between the scientist and the students. Therefore, it became a pedagogical goal of mine henceforth to always include the sciences in the arts, so that we can realize there are other frameworks with which people learn. And you talked about the older people. You know, in many cultures, knowledge is not committed to script. It's not in a book. It's not in an institution. So why don't we learn to realize the varieties of knowledge that exist and draw on those? Angela Davis very provocatively in her Blues Legacy and Black Feminism argues for orature, O-R-A, rather than culture, orature. So much of knowledge is simply spoken. It's oral. I mean, what do we learn through anthropology? Every culture has its understanding of knowledge and of learning. What is common between all of them is experience. So the elder person, I evaluate life experience. And I would say that's the basis even with our 18-month-old grandchild. Because they're already having certain experiences that even though the words don't come out right, they clearly want to talk about that because they're learning. Like they just got burnt touching the stove. And they want to communicate about that experience.